Hey everyone, so let's talk about value. It is the ultimate art element. Without value, you can't have any of the other elements. It is quite literally the element that focuses on light. And as such, it is the foundation of everything that visual artists do. Value is light and dark, black and white. It is contrast. It is mood. It is the ultimate tool in your kit for making images. The way that you use value is really going to set your work apart. I can't stress that enough. Value is, in very simple terms, relative variation in light and dark. It defines shapes, right? Black, white. It can define those areas in your composition with clarity, or sometimes without, depending on how you use it. It can imply depth. It can suggest texture. Like I mentioned before, you can't have texture without value. Value comes first. It provides visual direction in your composition, right? Where are those highlights at? Where are those shadows at? It creates contrast. It is the ultimate contrast in your work of art. There is no greater contrast than black next to white. And like I mentioned before, it sets the mood for the piece. If you limit the number of values in particular, you can create a certain atmosphere in your work. Okay. Here's some of the terms that we'll be dealing with. We'll go through them one at a time over the course of the lecture. All right, so using value, like I mentioned before, it's the strongest contrast you have available to you. Black next to white will always get attention, right? If you want somebody to sit up and really pay attention, see what you've made, using value contrast is your first order of business. Now, considerations, the most important is how much contrast, right? And how much range of value, right? The tonal range of the image is a big consideration. The more contrast you use, the more definition the piece has, the more focus you're going to create. The more range of value, the more you can control ambiance, right? That mood of the piece. And then, of course, media. As always, your choice of medium is going to affect in a profound way the type of value that you are able to employ, right? Certain materials create a super dark, rich black, and others not so much, right? So your choice is going to matter tremendously. As always, a work of art is nothing if not an expression of its medium. Okay. So value contrast. It is the thing that makes all the other elements visible, right? Without light, you can't see color. Without light, you can't have texture. You can't even make a line without value, right? A black line on a white piece of paper, that's value at its source. So again, the more contrast you employ in the work, the more you put black next to white, the more definition it'll have, the more focus the piece will have, and it will be an aid in guiding your viewer's eye through your composition. More about that later. So you can see in this Posada piece that, that use of black and white really clearly defines the figures in this piece, and with that definition comes pattern and movement, right? More about value pattern later. It's really important to your work. but you can't have it without contrast, right? You've got to have at least a certain level of contrast, and the way that you control it makes a big difference in the way that we perceive the work, the way that we, the way the work affects us. Okay. Achromatic. Relative light and dark of an area without regard for color. Achroma, without color. So this just essentially means black and white. Why would we want to leave color out? Well, sometimes color gets in the way. Sometimes color has a way of asserting itself, symbolically, emotionally into the work, and sometimes removing it allows us, again, to see the other elements more clearly. And again, value, it's not just about value, it's about every other element, right? Anyway, it's a beautiful illustration by Charles White. You should look at his work. He's just an amazing artist. Local value, right? Lightness or darkness of a surface without the effect of light and shadow on it, right? So we're pretty used to seeing the world with, the sun up, or at least a light on, and that affects the surface of any object, that creates, kind of a three-dimensional quality when light hits a surface, and there are shadows that are a result of that, or highlights that hit that surface. So local value is just the value of the surface of an object without that effect of highlight or shadow on it, right? So, for instance, here on the left, we've got, say you could see a sphere without light. It has an intrinsic value already. And then when you light it, you get highlights and shadows and reflected light and all that good stuff. So just in terms of, breaking things down, the local color is the color that thing, the local value is the value it has on its own, regardless of light and shadow. Decorative value. So this is flat value, right? Kind of like that previous, image that I showed you. You've got a circle that's flat gray versus a dimensional one. That flat gray is decorative, right? It stresses the flatness of a two-dimensional surface, okay? And so works of art that really do stress that flat area, we call them decorative. They have decorative value. And not like you're decorating your room. It is about surface, right? Embellishing a surface, a two-dimensional surface, okay? And that creates art that has a certain quality, right? Japanese prints, for instance, very flat, very decorative in their presentation. And it creates a certain feeling, right? A certain quality. Okay. Now, plastic value, on the other hand, uses the illusion of depth, right? That play of highlight and shadow on the surface of an object to create volume, to suggest space on a two-dimensional surface. And so you've got highlights, shadows, and cast shadows. And, you've probably seen this thing before, right? Breaking down, that play of light on a surface. So this is what we're talking about. This is a plastic value image. Okay? And painters in particular are really focused on this. You can really create a much more beautiful or dynamic image sometimes just by focusing on the edges of things, the found edge and the lost edge. And, lost edge is where, that surface kind of bleeds into another area, right? And you really can't tell the difference because they're so close in value. So your ability to see the edges of shapes controlled by value, very important in your work. Okay, so here's a Kollwitz drawing. Beautiful. Those subtle gradations between light and dark are very evocative, right? They very beautiful. Here's Henry Moore, pen and ink drawing, right? Suggesting space and volume through that use of value. So critical to your work. Okay, so let's think about dark and light a little more in depth. If we have a high key image, that's essentially an image that focuses on the lighter end of value. Likewise, a low key image focuses on those darker shadow areas. It doesn't mean that you don't have a mix of the other, one or the other, but there is a definite leaning towards one or the other in this work of art, right? So when you reduce value like that, you limit the range of value, the tonal range of value, you're going to have less detail. The image is going to become more mysterious as a result. Like, I can't really tell what's going on in this Robert Bauer, drawing, right? I kind of see a landscape and maybe there's some kind of delineations of a garden there, but I'm not really sure. He's using a high key palette and reducing contrast and detail as a result, and it creates a certain mysterious atmospheric quality, right? So think about that as you make decisions about your works of art, whatever you're making. Think about the range of value. How much contrast do I need? Or how much do I want to reduce that contrast and focus on a certain area of range to create the effect that I want, right? Very important. Likewise here, a low-key value image. This drawing has a pretty bright highlight as its focus, but everything else in this interior is dark, right? And hard to really make out what's going on. Right? Again, reducing the value range, focusing on the low end, in this case low key, creates a certain mood, right? So controlling contrast, controlling range is a big decision that you have to make every time you pick up your materials to make art. Okay, so the mock band effect. This is kind of an interesting phenomenon. If you look at this scale of values, if you look, say, at the left-hand side of each one of these bands, it's going to appear to be darker than the right side of the band. This is essentially a fault in the human eye. Like, we can't really differentiate value that clearly, so one value affects another in the image. So it's just kind of a lesson to be learned that each value that you're using is going to affect the one next to it. And I think we all intrinsically know that, but it's nice to be reminded every once in a while that it's all relative. There's, your job is to focus on relationships as an artist. And in this relationship, it's again, the ultimate relationship visually for a work of art is value, right? Okay. So, chiaroscuro, a technique that blends light and shadow, gradually, just, modeling from one to another to try to create a three-dimensional look in a work of art, right? Again, that play of light and shadow. If you manage it just right, you can give your image a rendered look of dimension and space. So a little bit of art history ahead of Chiaroscuro and Tenebrism. Like there's art that is decorative and flat, right? Remember, we learned decorative and plastic. Those are like two opposing forces in value. So medieval art, pretty decorative, pretty flat. That's the way they liked it. If there was any hint of shadow, it was almost accidental. Okay, so a lot of Islamic art tends to be very flat and decorative, and in some cases, will only focus on certain kind of pattern motifs. So again, flat, decorative works of art leading up to chiaroscuro. Here's a Japanese painting from the 1200s. Again, Japanese art, very flat, very focused on that two-dimensional surface, very decorative. Well, chiaroscuro, when it came along in the 1300s, reintroduced shadows to two-dimensional works of art, right? And so Giotto, in particular, was the artist that suddenly woke up and started appreciating shadows again and applied them to his figures in his work, and it was a pretty amazing development in the history of art, at least in the West. And so you can see here in this detail, there's a little bit of shadow under her chin and around her facial features, right? And the hands, a little bitty hint of shadow along the edges, okay? Well, this, of course, grows as the years go by. Artists get better and better at seeing those shadows and mimicking those plastic surfaces, highlight and shadow. Cimabue, same thing. You can start to see the development of that plastic use of highlights and shadows on these figures to give them a bit of depth. Not much, but a little bit. All right, and so, when the Renaissance kicks into full gear, you get artists like Bellini who are really pushing shadows and that plastic use of space on a two-dimensional surface. That play of light and shadow in this Dürer, amazing, right? The artist's eye starts to really become attuned to that play of light and shadow. It becomes, for painting in this period, like the ultimate goal. If you could capture that look, you were going to make a name for yourself. And of course, Da Vinci develops his own, right? He's Mr. Inventor. He always has to make his own way. He creates something called sfumato, right? The way that he applied the paint created this smoke-like quality. That's the sfumato. Fumato is smoke in Italian. So he had his own way of creating chiaroscuro effect. Okay. Now, Tenebrism follows chiaroscuro in the Baroque period, and this basically takes chiaroscuro and puts it on steroids, right? Like really pushes that contrast between shadow and highlight. There's still like that gradation, that blending from one to the other, but it's more extreme. The darks get darker, the highlights get brighter, the contrast and focus are ramped up. So Caravaggio is the master of this. He's the real, amazing artist of that period. He really pushed the drama in his work through value. Amazing stuff. And then, of course, Rembrandt, phenomenal painter, used Tenebrism to really to a dramatic effect in his work. Always just spot on, beautifully rendered work. Okay, so open value compositions versus closed value compositions. Open value means softer values that aren't really contained within shapes, right? The edges of those shapes are not always well defined, okay? And then a closed value composition is one that focuses more on clearly defined shapes that house each one of those values more clearly with more focus. And if you recall, I mentioned painters like to use the lost edge and the found edge to define objects or to obscure them or make them a little softer, or some combination of the two. It's not always one or the other. Okay, so here's a drawing that really illustrates that open value structure. Like, look at that cast shadow of that tomato, like the shadow on the back side of that tomato, or on this side of the tomato, is the same value as the shadow that it's casting. And so there's this openness between those two shape areas, right? And again, in the background, subtle gradation between light and shadow creates a certain mood, okay? Open values. Like here's a really amazing lithograph by Arenal. Again, subtle gradation from one into the other. Open value, where you can sometimes not see the transition from one shape to the other. Okay? Now, closed value, just the opposite. Values clearly defined by shape edges. There's a certain, again, typically a flatter look to closed value work. Okay? So, again, it really depends on your style and what's appropriate for the work that you're making. And again, like, it's not always one or the other. Sometimes you have a work of art that has open and closed shapes at the same time. Okay. Now, pattern, value pattern, so important for composition, right? When you strip away color from an image and you break those values down and really focus on where the highlights fall, where the shadows fall, you're really talking about using value to define shapes and how they're arranged in a composition. So it's, again, like value has a hand in all of the other elements of art. Organized areas of light and dark are essentially the compositional skeleton of the work. The value pattern is that underlying structure to the composition. And it's so important that you make good decisions early on when you're planning your work about where those highlights are going to fall, where the shadow is going to be in the work. That pattern that is produced will have a huge effect on your viewer and how pleasing that composition is. It's not just about putting shapes here and there, but it's also shapes in conjunction with their values that will make a composition successful. All right. So again, yeah, value pattern provides underlying movement, tension, and I can't stress enough when you're planning your works of art to go back to that design process and do thumbnail sketches and throw some value into those thumbnail sketches. Don't just sketch shapes. Think about values and where they fall. As you make those sketches, it'll help tremendously. Okay, so here's a notan, like that kind of study of where the highlights and shadows fall in a work of art. This is Bruegel the Elder, the Parable of the Blind. And you can see the arrangement of lights and darks in this, and how these diagonals running through the composition really keep the eye moving. Again, you should think about this and learn to see it not only in your work, but then in the work of others. Okay, and here's Mr. and Mrs. Andrews. Again, a value pattern study of what the final painting looks like. Again, you can see that sense of order and balance between the lighter areas and the darker areas of the painting. So critical to your work to think this way. I don't think it's necessarily a good idea to be a black and white thinker. There are always areas of gray, but when it comes to like foundational structures, it's not a bad idea to break things down, see them in black and white first, create that foundation, and then build upon it. Okay? So, again, value, so critical. It is the ultimate tool in your art kit. And I want you to study, consider it always. Don't take it for granted. Think about that play of light and shadow, and the fact that light, again, is your ultimate medium as an artist, right? Marshall McLuhan said the medium is the message. And for visual artists, our medium is light. It is our foundation. So anyway, go practice, make something fantastic, make something inspirational, and it's going to start with value. Okay, good luck.